One year is the one to go.
Yeah. Only because I like redheads. All right, well, good morning, everyone. You will have heard the announcement today. What's really encouraging is just the immediate warm feedback and enthusiasm from the businesses in this room, many of whom have been asking why the government doesn't do this already for many, many years, and who are delighted by the changes we are making. As am I. This will make a difference.
So is there any economic modelling around what impact it might have? What are your expectations around its boost, if you like, to New Zealand businesses and to the wider economy?
Yeah, look, that's a good question, and I did ask MB about how we would evaluate its impact going forward. And what they point out is that it's very difficult to measure, because if you are, for example, looking at the benefits you're going to get in terms of long-term industry creation, or taking what might have been a small firm up to export scale, you won't see some of those benefits for many years. So what I've required as part of this change is that MB report to me every 6 months on how they're seeing the economic impact assessment being used across government agencies, what sort of evaluation methods are being used, and that they also report back to people tendering on contracts about how that criteria is being applied. I think if we're transparent, we'll see it, because firms will literally see, wow, those guys got the contract because they agreed to take on more apprentices. They got the contract because they agreed to use a New Zealand subby.
Do you have an idea of how many New Zealand businesses are missing out right now?
Lots of New Zealand businesses are missing out right now, and I know that from the feedback that I get. Tales from New Zealand firms who are trying really hard to get to scale, and they say to me, it's literally easier to win a contract in Australia than it is to win a New Zealand government contract. And if you're a medium-sized business looking to go global, getting a big government contract can be transformational, because not only does it give you scale, it proves to the rest of the world that if your own government backs you and you're capable of a contract at that level, then they should back you too. And I've had countless firms tell me that our rules have been completely behind other countries in the world who clicked onto this ages ago, and they sort of say, well, why does New Zealand have this completely different approach?
We don't have an estimated number of how many businesses are missing out to international companies.
No, and here's a quite startling fact. I asked MB what proportion of current contracts go to New Zealand firms and what proportion of spend goes to New Zealand firms. They don't even collect that data. And to me, that shows the level of indifference that government has had about the impact its own spending can have. So from now on, we'll have a much better way of evaluating that and looking at that. I don't want to tie everyone up in endless monitoring reports. That would be the wrong direction to go in. But as I said today, I will be holding government agencies accountable for applying this policy. All ministers have been asked to evaluate how their agency is implementing it. And as I said, if we get people saying the rules weren't applied, well, we'll be calling those agencies out.
The Cabinet in August gave a fairly clear instruction to the Government Chief Digital Officer that he needed to certify that all work was delivered at the lowest cost, subject to the government's digital procurement objectives. This instruction would appear to be possibly slight tension with that, and that they've got to consider something else. If there's a conflict between the two instructions on big government IT projects, how do you expect that to be handled?
Because cost and value are not always about the lowest upfront cost, and that's sometimes where things have gone wrong in procurement. We all know you can buy the cheap thing on day one, but then if it falls apart 2 years later, you're no further ahead. And the same actually applies for IT contracting, which is evaluate what's actually going to have the least cost over the length of the contract, but in all matters, the government procurement rules will take precedence.
Is there any 10% of the decision has to relate to the New Zealand economy? That seems relatively low. How did you get to that number?
Well, we looked around the world. That's the rule that the UK has, and that's quite similar to what other countries who've tried to lean in for their local businesses have done. And of course, there is a balance to strike. Quality and cost do still matter. That's part of the overall way that we assess value. But I tested that with my officials. I said, should we go higher? And they were very confident that at 10%, it would absolutely swing the difference on some contracts. In fact, they even gave me some specific modelled examples to demonstrate how it would do that. Remembering that sometimes two tenders can be very similar in the cost that they say. So how do you get your head up above the pack? Well, from now on, the way to do that is show your economic impact for New Zealand.
Presumably, can you explain what some of the barriers have been over the last decade? You know, that Cameron's been advocating for this. Why haven't we done this before?
Yeah, well, two main reasons. The first thing is the reflexive response, which is, oh no, we always have to go for the lowest cost contract. That's a very narrow view, because we all understand that if we actually want this to be an economy that's growing and we want to get real value for taxpayer dollars, sometimes picking the Kiwi firm that can is going to ultimately be better for all of us. The other factor has been people, again, in a very purist way, saying, oh no, that would be against our free trade agreements. Well, in fact, just about all of our trading partners do this, and so I asked our officials to understand how they do that in a way that complies with their trading obligations, and I said, let's do the same thing. The Aussies are big on this, we can be too.
Presumably
The way that it's operated so far is the government has picked the procurement, can't say the word, you know what I'm saying, contract with the cheapest to the government. Is there a sense that this is actually going to cost the government money, having an emphasis on New Zealand companies that might have missed out before because they were a little more expensive than overseas companies?
Value always matters. Of course, we are not forgetting about that. But actually, it's often other things that have got in the way of Kiwi companies. As I said, Kiwi companies have missed out because you haven't had a big government contract before, or Kiwi companies have missed out because you've never done a contract of this scale before, or Kiwi companies who miss out because actually they choose to take on apprentices and that costs a little bit more. Well, I say, if they're taking on apprentices, that helps this economy, that helps those workers. That's something I think New Zealand taxpayers would back.
Sure, in the long term, but in the short term, is there a worry that this is going to actually end up costing more?
No, because actually when you deliver the most value, you get the best result. And that result can be measured both by the effectiveness of the contract that you've got in terms of the goods and services that are delivered, but also the impact that has for the economy as a whole. You know, think about it on a small scale. You're a subcontractor and you're asked to work on the big government bridge project, and suddenly you're able to scale up and hire more people than you've ever had before. You're able to teach them new skills, and then next time there's a government contract, you're ready for that too. So it has huge spillover benefits. IT is an area where it's particularly relevant. Time and time again, IT firms say, well, the Aussie firms always seem to win it. They just underbid us by a few $1,000s. And no one seems to take into account that if you gave that IT contract to a Kiwi company, that might be the difference between us becoming a datacom or not.
But as Minister of Finance, if it sits all right with you, looking at two contracts, potentially, I understand what you're saying about the long-term ramifications, but the short-term, literally picking the more expensive one, that's okay?
That will happen in some circumstances, but only where it will create more value.
There were concerns in March that when these proposals were put out for consultation, that they would remove the requirement for businesses to pay the living wage to contract staff, caterers, security guards and cleaners. That doesn't appear to be part of the change today. Is that something that the government is still separately considering?
Well, no, that is not part of the change today. There's been some confusion on that matter because that directive was never actually in the government procurement rules. The government procurement rules apply to 140 different Crown entities, and they apply to all kinds of contracting. The specific rule you're referring to was just a cabinet directive. It only applies to cleaning, security and catering contracts, and only in a small number of government agencies. It has affected around 2,000 people, and I didn't think it was worth the confusion of putting that in the procurement rules.
And on the international risk, have you just received any feedback from officials that there could be any potential risks in terms of international obligations, or has all the advice been complete or clear for all of this?
It has been complete and clear. I did test it because New Zealand is a trading nation and we respect the rules because we want other countries to respect us. And the key point here is that an international bidder can still bid on a contract and they can still be assessed in terms of the difference they will make in terms of economic impact. On the margin though, they will be encouraged to take on more New Zealand subcontractors to show more impact for New Zealand. And as I used in that example today. There have been examples of multinationals who've come here, dialed up the New Zealand impact, not got the contract, and gone, why do you guys do it so differently than the rest of the world? This is commonly accepted practice, and we've been very careful to adhere to the trade rules.
You've picked a different definition for local businesses than Business New Zealand suggested. They wanted overseas subsidiaries to be included as a local business in terms of this economic benefit test. Since we've gone to a narrower definition of sort of genuinely New Zealand-owned based businesses.
Yeah.
Can you just explain that decision?
Well, this is about genuinely New Zealand-owned Kiwi businesses. But we're also conscious that, as I said, international firms can demonstrate impact in New Zealand by engaging those Kiwi businesses, by helping Kiwi workers, by helping Kiwi industries. So we think they still get a fair foot in the door, but we're unashamed. This is about creating a level playing field for the small and medium-sized New Zealand businesses who've been missing out for too long.
Local government are also important procurers, around various communities. Are you hoping that this will extend to them? I mean, that will drive change there?
Well, it's always good when the government leads by example. And I already had a couple of major firms at this event today say to me, well, look, this is pretty good, and actually, we'll be thinking about how we do something similar in the way that we're procuring things. You're right, this stuff can have an impact. I am reluctant to tell local government to pull its socks up on this when the government itself took at least a decade to do it. We are now leading from the front, and I'm very willing to share our experience with local government because, if we could have every council taking this approach too, that'd be great for our communities, great for Kiwi jobs, great for Kiwi incomes.
Minister, you would have seen some of the stories in the last couple of days about your benefit changes to the 17 and 18-year-olds and some of the impact that that's having on people that are on sickness benefits and whatnot. One of those people, in terms of people that are having mental health crises, did you understand Louise Upson is deliberately cutting job seekers for 18 and 19-year-olds who are fighting cancer and in mental health crises?
Well, what Louise has reassured people is that where people have a permanent condition, there will be exemptions, but also that where people can't be in work, that they are able to be in training or education. And so there is some flexibility there.
Some have suggested the government is punching down on young people with cancer. How would you respond to that?
No, I would say that in my experience, every young person, no matter their circumstances, is aspirational for themselves and for their future. And we want to support them, and we know that their families want to support them. And we don't think it's punitive to say, look, help us engage you in education and training. The government subsidises it, we support it, and where you can work, we'll support you to do so.
Minister, you mentioned that some procurement contracts are going to Australia, or that sometimes New Zealand businesses are looking to Australia. Have you seen this article in Australia calling New Zealand's economy cooked? What is your reaction to that?
Well, I'd say the proof will come out over several years, not over one quarter. And I reckon our Kiwi economy will beat that Aussie economy over the next few years. Just give us time. Bit of trans-Tasman rivalry is never a bad thing, though.
Are you happy to see some of the banks passing on the interest rates?
Absolutely. It's great to see banks ensuring that New Zealanders get the benefit of the Reserve Bank's decision, and I've seen that some of them have passed it on very quickly. Others had, of course, already slightly factored it into their rates. But look, the point of the official cash rate is to ensure that everyday Kiwis have more cash in their bank accounts, and that happens when banks pass on the rate. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.